You're listening to In the Balance, an Iowa Judicial Branch podcast. Welcome back. This month I spoke with District 6 Judge Kevin McKeever about Iowa's jury service. To learn more about the history of jury service, what the selection process looks like, and the rights upheld by jury service in our country, keep listening. Thank you for joining me today, Judge McKeever. I know you're in the midst of a trial at the moment, so I appreciate you taking the time. Before we dive in, tell us a bit about your path to the district court bench.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I want to start with the fact that this is actually my second career. I began my professional career as an officer in the United States Navy. I received my commission in 1991, and I served on active duty between 1991 and 1998. In 1998, I went to law school, graduating in 2001, and I've had experience in two different states in the legal field. I started my legal career in Minnesota as an assistant Ramsey County attorney in St. Paul, Minnesota. I did that for approximately 6 years. Then I went to a place called ACT Incorporated in Iowa City, and I worked as a staff attorney there for 3 years. I then rejoined the trial attorney world as an assistant Muscatine County attorney in 2011, and then in 2015, I was appointed to the district court bench. So I've had, before coming onto the bench, I had some civil experience, arbitration experience, criminal prosecution experience, juvenile experience, and some other miscellaneous types of legal work that I did as an assistant and also as a staff attorney.
This month, we are going over Iowa's jury service, which, as a judge currently overseeing a jury trial, is a process you're in the midst of or have just gone through. Can you give us a brief explainer and history of jury service?
Certainly. So jury service is an extremely important component of our system of jurisprudence. The idea that as someone stands accused by the state of something in the criminal realm, that they have a right to be judged not by some special appointee and not by some official, but by their peers. And that is something that takes us back to the very beginning of our history as a nation. So it's deeply rooted in our system. With regard to the civil side of things, the same kind of principles apply, that having the opportunity to have one's differences settled in a peaceful manner and in a manner that is done by a neutral fact finder is something which is extremely important both for our society and for our democracy. And so the principles that this concept of jury service are based on, or is based on rather, is, I think, an extremely important one to understand. That jury service, and I tell juries who come in each time, I tell them that they should not consider it to be an inconvenience, not a distraction from everyday life, as many people in the public view jury service. I tell them they should view jury service as an opportunity to serve their community in a way that makes our community work. And without this type of system, it's hard to imagine how we would have a place where people can go to get their differences settled in a fair manner by a neutral party responsible for evaluating the facts.
So you've mentioned criminal and civil jury trials. What other types of cases can a jury hear and decide? How large or small of a trial do they see? Can you give us a little bit of explanation and examples of those?
Well, juries typically are used in either criminal cases or civil cases. There are other types of cases in our judicial system, but those kinds of cases typically are not handled by juries. And so, for example, divorce cases would be one example of a case that is not typically handled by a jury. If you have a divorce going on and you need to have a trial, that trial in Iowa is held in front of a judge. So, generally speaking, here in Iowa, if you have a jury trial, it is either going to be a civil jury trial or a criminal jury trial. The criminal jury trial, just for a brief explanation for people who may not understand the difference, if the state of Iowa believes that you have violated a law, then, and they charge you with what's called an indictable offense, you have the right to ask for a jury trial. And if you ask for a jury trial, then you get to be judged by 12 persons from the community, and those 12 people will decide all of the fact questions that are raised in the case. In a civil jury trial, you get to select a jury. There are only 8 people on the jury. And so there are some differences. A criminal jury trial has to return a unanimous verdict. In a civil jury trial, during a certain period of time after deliberations start, you can get a verdict that's unanimous, but then after a certain point, you only need 7 of the 8 people to agree that the verdict, agree on the verdict, and then they can return a verdict. Civil trials are generally some sort of dispute regarding money. Typically, you might see a dispute in a contract case or something similar to that. Often when there are big contracts, people will get into disputes that they are unable to resolve regarding how much something should be worth under the contract, whether all of the terms of the contract have been met, and those kinds of things. And that usually boils down to someone thinks that they're owed money, and that would be a civil dispute. And that's the difference between a civil and a criminal jury trial.
Walk us through the jury selection process from the viewpoint of an attorney or a judge.
So as a judge, what I'm primarily concerned with is the selection of a jury in a manner which is fair and consistent with the rules. The attorneys are also concerned with that, but they are asking questions to get responses from prospective jurors that will help them to select the jury that will be most fair and most impartial for whatever kind of case is being heard. As an example, if you are having a case that involves a company and there is someone on your jury panel who works for the company, they might be uncomfortable setting aside the fact that they work for that company, and that might interfere with their ability to be fair and impartial. And there are all kinds of things that could create those kinds of conflicts. When I bring the jurors in there, my main concern is that I want them to answer the questions honestly and completely, so that the lawyers can make the best selections that they can make, and the attorneys are trying to listen to these questions that are provided, listen to the answers that are provided, and make the best selections that they can. One thing, of course, that makes this process a little bit difficult sometimes is that if there is a sensitive subject that needs to be discussed, there's a concern that jurors might be reluctant to answer the questions. So we provide them with an opportunity to talk to us in private outside the presence of the other prospective jurors so that they can feel more comfortable answering the questions. If they feel more comfortable, they're more likely to disclose fully their feelings And when that happens, the attorneys can make the best selections they can because they have honest and complete answers to the questions that are posed to them.
Okay, so then let's imagine someone receives their jury summons in the mail. What does the process look like for them as a citizen being called to jury service?
Well, it might vary slightly from county to county, but in most counties, they receive a summons, they get a phone number to call, they call the phone number. If their particular number, most of them get some kind of a number on their summons. If their number is included in the group that's being called to the courthouse, then they will arrive at the courthouse at the designated time. They go to a room and check in, and then they watch a brief movie that goes over some of the core principles in our system of jurisprudence. And then once they finish watching the movie and the computer randomly selects the first, and the number will depend on what kind of case, as I mentioned before, but the first group of jurors to be questioned, those jurors will come up to the courtroom and walk in and take their seats. I swear them in. The attorneys will then begin asking them questions. Once the attorneys finish asking their questions, they're afforded strikes, and the people who are remain on the jury. I call those names forward, and then they're seated in the box, and I tell everyone else that I thank them for their participation, but they're free to go. They can stay if they want to, but usually no one stays because they're happy to be able to go on about their day. As the process goes on, I try to explain as much to the jury panel as possible with regard to the importance of them answering the questions correctly, the importance of them being completely honest and open about their feelings. And normally people open up once they get used to the question-answer format and once they are told how important their honest answers are.
And the jury at the end of the trial reads a verdict, as you've mentioned before, but the judge is responsible for the sentencing, if there is any sentencing to be had. Can you tell us a bit about that distinction?
So the jury is responsible to decide all fact questions. So the jury will reach the verdict, which means that they will decide whether the facts presented will constitute a conviction in the case of a criminal case, or if it constitutes liability in the case of a civil case. So the judge is responsible for sentencing in a criminal case. And so the jury has nothing to do with punishment in a criminal case. And I guess that's the distinction. The question of sentencing is one that's left to the discretion of the judge. But as to whether or not the person who's accused by the state is guilty or not guilty, that is the exclusive decision of the jury in a jury trial. Now, I should say in a criminal trial, people can request for a judge to decide whether they're guilty or not guilty. So if you have a trial to the court, then the judge can make that decision about guilt or innocence and can also, or I should say guilty or not guilty, the judge can also then decide what the sentencing is going to be. So there are a couple of different ways this can play out in a criminal action. In a civil action, generally the jury decides both whether there's liability and whether or not there is any financial responsibility associated with that liability and how much that financial responsibility is. The one distinction in a civil case is that some of the liability may be purely a question of law. And so if there is a legal reason why the verdict should be a certain number as a matter of law, for whatever reason, and there could be a number of different examples of that, then those things are generally decided by the judge. But with regard to liability and how much liability each side may or may not have, or each defendant, I should say, may or may not have, and the amount of damage that's caused in a civil case, all of those things are left to the jury to decide.
Great. I never knew that distinction before. And in Iowa and around the country, jury service has been used as a cover for a variety of scams at times. So how can people be vigilant against these scams, and who can they report them to if they encounter them?
All right. Well, I guess first of all, I should say, if anyone is contacted and they are contacted by someone who is claiming to want people to respond to some sort of a summons or jury service, one immediate red flag should be if that person who is doing the contacting asks for any money. We will never call anyone asking for any money for any reason. And so I think one of the common scams has been to request some sort of payment by a card. Typically it's a gift card of some sort. Some of the MasterCard and Visa gift cards or other credit card gift cards have been requested by scammers. We will never ask anyone that we contact for any money at any time for anything. If you have any question about something you receive in the mail, you can always look up the number to the courthouse, your local courthouse, and call that number. And if you find that the number on the paper looks suspicious, then look up the phone number to the courthouse independent of whatever phone number the scammers are trying to get you to call. And so the other thing, I guess that's number one. Number two is that we will never threaten out of hand to arrest someone simply because they may have missed their jury service. If you miss jury service, you may get a summons to come in and explain to the judge why you missed jury service. But there will never be someone who will ask you for money in exchange for some kind of bail that helps you to avoid arrest. That is not how the process works. So anyone calling or writing you a letter saying that you have to pay a certain amount of money to avoid trouble is not legitimate. And get a hold of the courthouse, get a hold of the law enforcement, and report it immediately, because they are trying to take your money, and that is not something that the justice system is interested in doing. We want citizens to come in here and serve, and it is a requirement, so you do have to come. But it is not something that you will ever see from us that says, pay us $800 or you're going to be arrested today. That is never going to happen.
Right. And lastly, if there is one thing you'd like to leave our listeners with today about jury service, what would it be?
No one ever wants to do jury service. No one ever comes here saying, I can't wait to be selected for a jury. But almost everyone I've talked to, and I have talked to hundreds of people who have served on juries, the overwhelming majority of those people say that it was a wonderful experience. Once they come and they hear all the evidence in a trial, they see how things work, and they get a chance to serve on a jury. And sometimes we do some tough cases. And sometimes the subject matters that we deal with are not pleasant. But the overwhelming majority of the people who come here, who get selected, who do it, say that it was a great experience and that they're glad that they got picked. And it's interesting because I get that feedback from almost everyone I talk to. And I talk to all of the jurors who serve on the juries for jury trials that I preside over. I talk to each and every one of them. And so when you get your summons, show up. It's your responsibility. Have a good and positive attitude. It's a much better experience than you think it's going to be. And don't take my word for it. The people who do it say that it was a great experience, overwhelmingly. No one ever wants to do it before they're picked. Almost everyone is glad they did it when it's over.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today, Judge McKeever.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to In the Balance, an Iowa Judicial Branch podcast hosted and produced by me, Marissa Gaal. If you would like more information about Iowa's courts, you can visit www.iowacourts.gov. You can also follow the Iowa Judicial Branch on Twitter and YouTube at Iowa Courts. This episode of In the Balance is now adjourned. Until next time.